A prominent NFL expert believes that the New Orleans Saints will make the playoffs in 2023. We're going to find out why. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, you can subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast, and keep the conversation going one-on-one with me at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnSaints. And as always, I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert, credential member of the media, senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network, Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation site covering the New Orleans Saints, and here with you every single Monday through Friday and then some on Locked On Saints. And on today's episode, we welcome in Trevor Sikkema of Pro Football Focus, big-time friend of the show. He's here to take a look at a couple of different things with us. We'll take a look at who we believe will be the most impactful rookie in 2023, why Derek Carr's Raiders passed wasn't Derek Carr's fault entirely, and how that applies to the New Orleans Saints, and why he believes the New Orleans Saints are going to get to the playoffs. So to kick things off, I just asked him straight up, Trevor, why is it that you believe the New Orleans Saints will make the playoffs in 2023? Here's what he had to say.
Yeah, it's funny. I did that appearance, and as people could tell from my Twitter handle, Tampa Bay Trey, I'm from the Tampa Bay area, and my good friends who are Bucs fans were not happy that I was predicting the New Orleans Saints to win the division and make the playoffs. But I really do think that it's in the cards for them, especially right now when we look at a lot of optimism with this group moving forward. It's a veteran defensive group. I know they're losing a lot of guys on the interior, but they brought some new faces in. So it's not like it was like, hey, we really got robbed in free agency, weren't able to replace them. They bring in Nathan Shepard, bring in Kalen Sanders. And then you've got a ton of different players that they are bringing to the table on both sides of the ball, with the rookie class included. But really, it comes down to, this is a nice roster. I felt as though their biggest deficiencies last year were with the quarterback position. When it comes to Derek Carr, I am more so on the love it side of, do you love it or hate it with Derek Carr? And I feel like it's just so polarizing, this kind of player. And I really do think that the truth is probably somewhere in between. Like, you look at a lot of his struggles and why it was kind of a disappointment during his tenure with the Vegas Raiders. And a lot of people look at, okay, like, Carr wasn't blameless. I'll definitely give you that. But I also feel as though the supporting cast around him was just not ideal. And some people will point to it and be like, what do you mean? He had Devontae Adams. Well, he had Devontae Adams for 1 year. And at that point, Josh McDaniels is his head coach. I'm not really in on Josh McDaniels as a head coach at this point. Not sure that is going to be his long-term future in this league. It feels like he is more of an offensive coordinator than he is a head coach. And I think even beyond that, when you go further back, the offensive line wasn't what it needed to be. The offensive play calling wasn't there. And it never came together for him. But like, some years, the run game would be great for the Raiders, but then the pass blocking and the pass catching weapons, like, they weren't there. Other years, you look at last year, you go, okay, you got Hunter Renfrow, you got Devontae Adams, you got Darren Waller. Okay, like, the passing weapons are up to par, and Josh Jacobs is leading the league in rushing. But then, like, man, the offensive line, it feels like, could not find any kind of consistency and chemistry to keep it going. So again, I'm not trying to say that Carr was blameless during the struggles that happened with the Raiders, but I do still think that when you put a guy of his talent in New Orleans with that roster, with that offensive line, with that receiving group that is growing there, and a veteran defense behind him, to me, that spells out the playoffs, and especially does when you look at their schedule. Depending on what you're looking at, whether you're looking at wins and losses from last year or whether you're looking at projected wins and losses for this year, if you look at last year's win totals, the Saints have the easiest schedule in the NFL. If you're looking at projected win totals, they have the second easiest schedule in the NFL. So either way that you kind of slice up what could be for 2023 and the opponents that they're going to bring in, they've got a very favorable schedule. And so it's not a super strong division anyways. I think it's probably going to come down to them and the Atlanta Falcons at the very end. I don't think the Bucs are going to be too far behind. Carolina, I think, is a total wild card, of course, whatever that offense is going to be.
Right.
But I do kind of think it's going to come down to the Falcons and the Saints, who's going to win that division, who's going to end up going to the playoffs. And I think I'm going to give that veteran experience to the New Orleans Saints right now as we're kind of getting into training camp, OTAs, all that stuff.
Yeah, and it does feel like, you mentioned the quarterback position. It does feel like they had some deficiencies over on the defensive side as well. Two areas in particular, the run defense, which is 24th in the NFL, which, look, if you're looking at a defense and saying, okay, what type of defense is going to allow the most points? The defense that's 24th in the NFL against the run, or the defense that's 24th against the pass? It's going to be the one that's 24th against the pass. That's the one that's going to allow the most points, make things a little bit trickier over on the offensive side. So not as bad a situation as it can be. But one of the big things that I look at, Trevor, is their inability to take the ball away. Single-digit takeaways this year, some of the lowest numbers in franchise history when it came to takeaways. We speak all the time with the players about sort of the mentality of what it is that it takes to create a takeaway. But when you look at these names, Marshawn Lattimore, Tyrann Mathieu, Marcus May, you've got Paul Sidibe, now Alontae Taylor, who had a great rookie season. It sure feels like they should be taking the ball away more. Do you think maybe we see a little bit more of that over in 2023, especially with all the attention they've given their defense this year?
Yeah, they should. Takeaways are so tough, right? Because it's going to be a bullet point for every single coach, every single game, right? Win the turnover battle. And that, of course, the part that you can really control about that is that you're not putting the ball in a harm's way. Right. You're not fumbling the football, all that stuff. So that's what they're mainly preaching. But they also, the emphasis on going to get takeaways, every single defensive coordinator in the NFL, it is, like I said, it's a major bullet point that they have every single week. But there's no guarantee that you're going to have ample opportunities to go get the ball even if you are playing well. So you really, with turnovers, there's so much luck and chance involved with them that you simply want to have the players that are ball hawks, that that have that mentality that you mentioned for takeaways. And when you look at the secondary, you mentioned a handful. I mean, Marshawn Lattimore is somebody who we know can get interceptions. Paul Sidibe, something I loved about him when he was at Stanford was the ball skills that he played with. This sometimes
former wide receiver.
You're right. Yeah. He was attacking the ball in the air like a wide receiver because he's got that background. So they check those boxes. Tyrann Mathieu, we know, is one of the best playmakers on the ball that we've seen over the last decade, going back to his time at LSU as well. Marcus May is the same way. You got Bradley Roby, you got Alontae Taylor. Like, these are the names that you want in the second. That if you get some pressure up front, if you force some errant throws, if the accuracy isn't exactly where it needs to be, the ball maybe bounces up a little bit, it's a little bit off target, whatever it is, you've got players there who have that kind of mentality to go up, get the ball, and turn the ball over. So I do think that is something that, as much as I want to say, like, I think that that's something that's going to improve, it still takes a lot of chance and luck, but they've got the players in the building to be able to do that if the luck kind of goes their way.
All right, family, coming up next, we're getting a little bit, let's just say more in depth on the Derek Carr talk. You heard Trevor say it wasn't all his fault in Las Vegas. So why should Saints fans believe in Derek Carr despite a bit of a downturn over the course of the past two seasons? We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the NFL and the number one sportsbook in all of America, here partnering with us on the Locked On Podcast Network. And we're super excited about it. You're going to want to go and check them out today, especially if you've never been to FanDuel before. It's your lucky day. You can head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon to get a hold of a no-sweat first bet of up to $2,500. That's bonus bets that come back if your first bet doesn't win, meaning that there's no losing with your first bet over at FanDuel.com/lockedon. They have a great app as well that's safe, secure, super easy to use. You can do immediate withdrawals when you've got your money in the account, all of that. FanDuel is awesome. You can go check them out today for NFL odds, NBA Finals odds, of course, kicking off later or tipping off later on tonight. All of that. So make sure you go and check them out today. FanDuel.com/lockedon so you take advantage of that no sweat first bet of up to $2,500 in bonus bets. Once again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. For all the everydayers out there, appreciate you very much for making us your first listen of the day every day. So now we're taking a look at Derek Carr. Trevor Sikkema mentioned that, the downturn in Las Vegas wasn't just Derek Carr's fault, wasn't solely unblameable, but that it wasn't his fault. So what is it that makes that impact, and why should the New Orleans Saints feel positive about what they're getting in Derek Carr? Here's what Trevor had to say.
I don't know we don't know exactly what Davante Adams was talking about when he said this quote earlier this offseason, but he basically said, this is not what I thought it would be. When I was signing with the Raiders, whatever he meant, whether it was the fact that Derek Carr is gone now, whether it's been offensive play design, whether it's just been offensive flow and offensive game planning, offensive philosophy overall, whatever it was, Davante Adams was clearly not happy. And he was basically just saying, yeah, it kind of is what it is now for me. This situation is not what I thought that it was going into it. I signed a massive contract. I can't go anywhere. There's nothing that I can really do. And so I've just kind of got to be okay with it. And I think certainly him losing Derek Carr was probably a big chunk of that quote, because that's his guy, right? Going back to Fresno State, these two were absolutely lighting it up for 2 seasons in college football before they became pros. And so that reuniting was something that was certainly alluring to Davante Adams when he was moving on from Green Bay. But I also believe that the Josh McDaniels part of it probably goes in, because if there were conversations between McDaniels and Adams where it was like, hey, probably not going to bring back Derek. I know that's really tough for you. I know you came here for Carr, but we're probably moving on from him. Either presenting something to him like, here's what I'm thinking for how we're going to do the offense moving forward, or just coming to him almost like a collaboration. If that would have happened, I'm not so sure we get that quote from Davante Adams.
Yeah, great point.
And I don't think that happened. So McDaniels, coming from the Belichick Patriots tree, which we saw this with Matt Patricia, right? My way or the highway. And it was awful in Detroit. McDaniels might be somebody who's like, no, I was head coach of the Broncos. It didn't work out. I was offensive coordinator for the Patriots for a long time. Then after that, I told myself I wasn't going to leave the Patriots unless it was the opportunity for me to do it the right way, or my way, essentially. And I feel like that's where we might be with the Raiders. I feel like he might be saying, no, we're doing things my way. And it feels like my way is not working with me. So a lot of things go into why it didn't work with the Raiders. And they've been such a polarizing team. I used the word polarizing before, but I think that that's the right way to do it, because this has been a fringe playoff team for so long. Like, do they barely make the playoffs? Do they barely miss the playoffs? They're not really making noise when they do make the playoffs. Like, okay, they're just short when they don't. Like, they've been right there the whole time, but it's always something with the Raiders. They just have not been able to put it together. And I don't know if that happens under McDaniels.
You have to imagine, too, that Derek Carr never having a top 20 defense throughout his time, or rather a defense better than 20th, has had a little bit of an impact on him as well. I know that he referenced that to us when we spoke to him during his introductory press conference. This is probably going to be the best. Well, he didn't say it like this, but what he implied was that this will be the best defense that he has played with throughout his career. Clearly, that helps to move the needle a little bit for him as well. And that's a place where Las Vegas was a little bit deficient throughout his time. Throughout his time with the Raiders as well. So I think my question is, I think a lot of folks will look at sort of the offensive head coach and quarterback tandem and think that that's the way to go. But there is something to be said about having the defensive head coach with the good defense and the above average quarterback, and what that can be too. Yeah. Yeah.
There's not like a formula like, an offensive head coach means you're winning the Super Bowl. A defensive head coach means you're like living in the past. There's not a one size fits all. That's why we see all different kinds of mixing and matching around the NFL. It's simply the best coaching staffs are just the ones that are very similar in their visions, that respect each other, that have like great chemistry with both sides of the ball. When you get that, then you play a lot of that complementary football that teams like to talk about. And so, to get the best out of a quarterback, you don't always have to have an offensive head coach. And I do think that that's sometimes funny. Can that be a great asset for them? Yeah, especially if it's a guy who's been doing it for a long time, who's been on the cutting edge of something, who maybe played quarterback before, who's coached really great quarterbacks before, whatever. There are all sorts of advantageous points of offensive guys becoming head coaches for franchise type quarterbacks or guys that they want to get the most of, guys that they think have a high playoff or Super Bowl type of ceiling at the position. But that's not to say it can't work the other way around. Sometimes defensive head coaches, like you said, can even challenge a quarterback in ways that they aren't used to. If you are just so used to being coached by an offensive head coach, and you're just hearing that side of the ball all the time, well, all of a sudden, if the guy who's now in charge of the team, the CEO of the team, if you will, is coming at things from a defensive perspective, maybe that's like a complementary part of your game that you didn't know you needed. So yeah, it's not a one size fits all. It's not like you've got to have an offensive head coach to get the most out of a new quarterback or a good quarterback. I think that it's simply the coaches that know how to deal with players the best and try to find out what players need the best. They don't let their egos get in the way, right? I think that that's a major issue with some of these coaches in the NFL is you've got to take pride in your work. Like you've got to believe that you are a genius, a guru, that what you were about to call is going to work. You have to have faith in that. You have to have confidence. You have to have pride in that. But there is a very fine line between having pride in your work and having an ego in your work. And I think that that's sometimes when we get really bad coaching that can ruin great quarterbacks, ruin great offenses and defenses and things like that. So as long as these head coaches, whether offense or defense, are approaching things the right way, you can even sometimes get new ability, new perspective out of players that you didn't even intend on doing if you do things the right way.
I love just being able to sit back and like deconstruct all of these misconceptions around the NFL game with Trevor here on another episode of Locked On Saints. One of the other things that I think of is that the Saints brought in Derek Carr, and then after they brought him in, they bring in Bryan Edwards, they bring in Foster Moreau, which what a phenomenal story he's been here in New Orleans, and then they bring in Jonathan Abrams over on the other side of the football. What's the value of getting a guy like Derek Carr or bringing in a quarterback and then bringing in guys that are familiar with him and putting them around him?
I think just confidence, right? I talk about this a ton, especially being a draft guy, because there are so many talented players that come into the league. And I was just having this conversation the other day. It might have been on one of the Locked On podcasts that I was on, actually. So if anybody's a loyal Locked On listener, they might have heard this already. But the difference between the guys that make it in the league and the guys that don't, it's not often talent. Like when you get drafted, when you get to this point, you probably have the talent to make it. Like the scouting staffs, the general managers, there's a good chance they don't just totally whiff on your talent. The difference between the guys that make it and the guys that don't are the ones who struggle early, like every young player does in the league, but they don't lose confidence in themselves. They can say, okay, I'm going through struggles, but these are learning lessons. I'm taking that and I'm moving forward with it. And it's those guys that can make unfamiliar situations feel familiar, because everybody's most confident when they're in their own environment, right? We're all most confident when we're at home. We know where everything is. We know how long it takes to get here and there. Like we feel like we have control over our day. We feel like we have control over who we are when we are in our environment. And when you move all the way from Las Vegas to New Orleans, and it's a totally new city for the first time in your career, new coaching staff, new players, new everything, even a couple of guys that you notice in the locker room that you could just strike up an old conversation with because you've been friends before. Like that stuff can sometimes be an inch that goes a mile. That can be okay. Like, yeah, like I'm more comfortable here. I'm making this locker room my new home. And those are the ways that, especially when, look, Derek Carr's no spring chicken, right? It's not like they're signing him so that they can figure things out for 3 years and then maybe sign him to another contract. Like, okay, maybe it's not like do or die year one, but you got to look all right. Like you got to look like the investment is at least worth it in year one. So he kind of has to hit the ground running here. So those players, for however much they contribute on the field, just that familiarity and ability to maybe allow your new quarterback to feel more at home, to have some guys that he's used to talking to give him a sense of confidence of where he is, that could mean so much for him, especially trying to start out hot like I know they want to.
All right, y'all, coming up next, who will be the most impactful rookie in 2023? It should come as no surprise who Trevor picks here, but the reasons why are pretty intriguing, and how a new coaching staff addition could potentially help unlock that player's highest potential. Got that coming up for you as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's get it. Who Dat Nation, wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints, our conversation with NFL and NFL draft analyst Trevor Sikkema at Tampa Bay Trey on Twitter if you want to go and check him out from over at PFF. Next up, I asked Trevor who he believes will be the rookie to make the biggest impact in 2023. And then we got into a pretty interesting conversation about the coaching staff additions for the New Orleans Saints this offseason and how it could potentially unlock the highest potential of that rookie.
Well, Bryan Bresee, it's the obvious answer. Like, he's going to have all the opportunity in the world, I think, to play. I don't know what to make of Bresee. I'm going to be honest with you. I had him a lot lower on my rankings just because he is one of those players that, as outside scouts, so I would say more like media scouts, we don't get the opportunity to sit down with all of these players and truly like get to know them, where they came from, what happened in their life over the last couple of years. Context to either why they succeeded or maybe why they underperformed. And Bryan Bresee is a former number 1 overall recruit in the country. Right. There's no other way to put it. He underperformed. He did not have the college career that people thought that he was going to have. Now, the ACL injury, okay, the knee injury was a big reason why. Okay, and then you go back this year, he's got some illnesses that he is working through. He had the tragic family matter that happened with him that would affect anybody and their job. So we have to take that into account as well. But, you know, you look at him in this past year, like, I felt like he was carrying some bad weight. I felt like he was not as conditioned as he needed to be. And that all makes sense when you take into account him coming off the injury and the off the field stuff and him going through his illnesses. Like, all of that makes total sense. But I don't know what to, there's no guarantee, even though the context helps us understand why it happened, it doesn't help us know for certainty that will not be an issue, that he will, he'll be back to exactly the prospect that we thought. There's no guarantee that that's the case. So it's a big roll of the dice. I thought it was a big roll of the dice taking him in the first round, even with the high ceiling that he has. But there's no doubt about it that he always fit the Saints profile. You know, I do those mock draft competitions, and I do them for accuracy once we get closer to the draft. And obviously, the further you get into a mock draft, the more difficult it is to pick a player to a team, just because so many guys could be off the board. I had Bryan Bresee going to the New Orleans Saints at the end of the first round because he just felt like a Saints kind of player. He is this big, uniquely built, uniquely fast interior defensive lineman who can give you some work as an edge rusher in an odd front. And he can play all sorts of different positions for you. Everything from a 5 tech all the way into a 0 tech. He can play basically everything along the defensive line. That's what the Saints need. And you mentioned, they weren't great at run defense last year. They've got new bodies coming in, like I talked about at the top of the show. He will have an opportunity to earn some snaps. And I'm very interested to see how much he is going to be on the field, especially early on in this career. Does the switch flip as early as training camp and the preseason for him? Because if it is, that's going to be a huge boost to that new defensive line.
Yeah, really looking forward to seeing him in team drills. So far, we've really only gotten the opportunity to see him in individuals and things like that. And not that there's nothing to take away from those, but really, really interested to see what happens when other guys are kind of putting their hands on him. If you were to highlight sort of one thing, you talked about that high ceiling. If you were to sort of highlight one thing about his game that gives him that high ceiling, despite the potential concerns that could be there with the context included, what would you highlight about Bryan Bresee's game?
Yeah, I mean, it's the explosiveness. I mean, people who are 6'5", 305 pounds, they just don't get off the ball the way that he does. There's a couple of
Trevor,
reps.
I am neither 6'5" nor 305 pounds, and I couldn't do what he does.
We have a joke on the NFL Stock Exchange podcast that Connor and I are both 6'5", 240 pounds, which is not the case. I'll break the news here on this podcast, but I'll never say it on our podcast. But no, it's right. And the way that he moves is fascinating. It's alluring. That's why you draft him at the back end of the first round for this what if with him. And there are a couple of reps that I remember watching when I was scouting him where he's getting off the ball and he's lined up on one shoulder of an offensive lineman, and he immediately gets across the face of the other shoulder. He's ripping his arm up underneath the offensive lineman's arm, and it's just like, boom, okay, there's an immediate win. The quarterback's got to then bail out of that pocket within 2 seconds. He's now on the run. It's a scramble drill. It's a huge win for Bryan Bresee, and that's what you want to see more of. I'm worried about the strength profile because even though he is 6'5", 305 pounds, again, that conditioning part of it, it just didn't seem like he had that density to him. The sand in the pants, the ability to really anchor when double teams are going right in your face. If you face a lot of duo teams, then they're going to be targeting Bresee from what they saw last year on tape and see if he can handle it. So that part of the ceiling is what he can be as an interior penetrator, that is what you want that's what you want him to be. That's why you draft him in the first round, for that athletic ability at that unique size.
Trevor, you know your NFL stuff incredibly well. You know your college draft stuff incredibly well, as always. If I remember correctly, you know the Florida Gators very well as well, yeah?
I do. I am a University of Florida grad, so I do
That's
know
what
the
I thought.
Gators pretty well.
Can you tell us a little bit before, as we wrap up here? We've been talking about Bryan Bresee and sort of the things that he needs that can help him in terms of his development in the NFL. What impact can Todd Grantham, former DC for the Florida Gators, now defensive line coach here in New Orleans, what kind of impact could a guy like Todd Grantham potentially have in helping him get there?
He very much fits what I feel like, I don't claim to follow the Saints as closely as a beat reporter or an expert on the team such as yourself, but the Saints have always been a very aggressive team to me. On offense, they're a team that really likes to roll the dice and do what they need to win. And it's always felt like on defense, they've always been an aggressive team. That is what Todd Grantham was when he was defensive coordinator of the Florida Gators. When it was good, oh buddy, it was good. He was sending it was perfect blitzes at all times. He was bringing pressure on the pocket. He was demanding almost on a weekly basis. What Todd Grantham would do when he was at UF was he would demand the other team's quarterback to beat them. And he would say, we're going to throw pressure at you. And if you can't handle the pressure, you're going to crumble. So it's man coverage on the back. It's pressure up front. It's fast athletic linebackers. Like it's all sorts of pressured defense. And he was a big time risk taker. I remember there were a handful of blitzes that didn't work, but holy cow, the ones that did were the ones that were timed up perfectly to where it was a defensive series that stopped everything exactly where it needed to stop. Gave the rest of the team and the rest of the crowd watching, especially at home, a ton of momentum. He plays a very fun brand of defense, but there's no doubt about it. He is going to be go, 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 and he is going to make it so that quarterback's got to play their best game under pressure if they're going to beat him, because that's his style.
All right, family, one more big thank you to Trevor Sikkema at Tampa Bay Trey on Twitter. Please go and throw him a follow. Doing big things over at PFF. You can also check out the NFL Stock Exchange podcast as well. Coming up later on today, we'll be live for the Locked On Saints podcast over on the Locked On Saints YouTube page. We're going to be taking a look at a little bit more of Mickey Loomis's comments, as well as more of what we've seen in terms of the deployment and alignments throughout the second day of media presence for OTAs. We got all that coming up for you later on today for all you everydayers who continue to come through. Appreciate you as always for making Locked On Saints a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, say hi. And if you want to keep this conversation going, just head over to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnSaints. As always, y'all, if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how your mom and them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.